Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Madison's Notes. I'm Laura Laurent, and we are the official podcast of the James Madison program here at Princeton University. This week, we have on the show a repeat offender, Professor Graham McAleer, who is a professor of philosophy at Loyola University, Maryland. Now, he was on for episode 12 of this season to discuss with his co-author their recent book, The Wisdom of Our Ancestors. However, this episode will be a bit different from that one, as Professor McAleer has published a solo book on Tolkien and his philosophy of war. We discuss his letters and personal writings that support the claims that McAleer is going to make, as well as the context and experiences which informed Tolkien's writings. Overall, I'm very excited to provide this episode to you and invite you into this conversation. So let's welcome Professor McAleer onto the show. Professor McAleer, welcome back to Madison's Notes. Really looking forward to discussing your recent publication, Tolkien, Philosopher of War, with you. It was such a fun read. I really enjoyed getting to see a side of Tolkien from your perspective and different philosophical perspectives. So welcome back.
Yeah, thank you. Thrilled to be here.
Well, I want to get started. Tolkien is a beloved author for thousands and thousands, and possibly one of the largest authors taken into film and media and games. And I just want to ask you, what is your personal relationship with Tolkien? Was it an academic one? Did you find him through his philology? Were you engaged with his books as a young person? What was your initial relationship with Tolkien that drew you into writing this book?
Yeah, I have to say it was really the students, because, they were all thrilled by the Peter Jackson films back in the day. And because, academics always want to kind of meet the students where they're at, I thought, okay, well, there's a great topic for courses. So, let me build a seminar around kind of philosophical elements of Tolkien. And I had some fantastic classes when the students were into Tolkien, because it was a huge cultural event, those movies. The classes were fantastic and the student interest was fantastic. But, fashions changed. Game of Thrones took over for a while. So I did a class on comparing Game of Thrones and Tolkien. And then, to be honest, the last time I taught a class on Tolkien, on occasion, I did find myself having to explain who some of the characters were, what some of the storylines were. The students knew that it was kind of cool, Tolkien, but a lot of them were not like they used to be. I used to have students who kind of knew everything about Tolkien. They were true sort of nerds about Tolkien, and that definitely has evaporated. I don't say you couldn't find at Loyola a student who was a devotee in some way, but the kind of cultural moment, I do think that has subsided significantly, despite his ongoing tremendous presence in the culture at large. But, a lot of these memes that rely on Gollum or Gandalf, I think probably would be a little lost now on some of my students. So my interest in Tolkien actually didn't wane, right? They kind of lost interest, but I got more and more into the guy. And especially when I read his letters, that for me, it was a tremendous revelation. And because that gave me the sense that, you really could do something super philosophical with Tolkien, because I think he was extremely, Christopher, the son, who kind of edited the works, said that as Tolkien aged, he became increasingly preoccupied by the metaphysical and theological foundation of the work. And you just see it in his letters that he's not a formally trained philosopher, but his interests are often extraordinarily philosophical. And so I kind of wanted to, the more I kind of found that out in him, the more, I became ensnared in, the Tolkien world.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious because, yes, he was an enormous cultural moment, and it breaks my heart to think that Gollum or Gandalf wouldn't be as widely understood as someone who likes to create those memes myself. But I'm curious, how did the Tolkien Philosopher of War part start to marinate for you, in that you were teaching these courses, you're seeing how philosophical he is. There's other people also writing about his philosophical concepts. And was that something that came from your other academic work? Was that simply the thread that you saw coming out the most that needed to be writing about, was his specific positions on warfare and what that impacts and how it's built. I would love to hear more about how that became more of the focus within the framework of Tolkien for you.
Yeah, so the class that I taught at Loyola, and I have taught, a number of times, is called The Morals and Politics of the Lord of the Rings. So you're right. My first encounter with sort of teaching Tolkien was more generic about just the value structures, the political structures. But then I'd always been interested in the sort of the problem of violence and order. I would say all my books kind of deal with this basic topic. And then as I got sort of thinking more, I don't know, it just started to sort of emerge that I was like, wow, this thing is like, it's all about war. And then in the letters, of course, he says things like that. He says it's a story about war. And then when you know a little bit about his biography, then you're like, okay, well, how does that work? And then I was at some point reading someone who knew Tolkien. Didn't know him personally, but had definitely been in his kind of world because he's one of the distributivists, a poet called David Jones, a Welsh poet. And one of David Jones's long poems, he wrote 2 long poems. One of them has a scene of infantrymen walking to the trenches and the way in which they would stumble or the way in which they couldn't retain their ranks tightly enough. And that really got me thinking about something that I'd noticed the students not complain about. The students often noticed it, that the films are they're kind of fast paced. But when you read the books, they actually go quite slowly, and it takes the fellowship ages to walk out of the Shire. And then there are these episodes where they get into this field, and as Tolkien describes it, it's very tussocky. So they keep tripping. And that put me in mind of, because David Jones, I should have said, David Jones was also an infantryman in the First World War. And that got me thinking that, okay, wait a moment, there are parts of The Lord of the Rings where you're getting the perspective of the infantryman, that the time it takes to walk places, the fact that a lot of soldiering is just walking. And so that really got me thinking like, okay, wait a minute, I'm going to now really focus on the sort of military war aspects. And then when I looked into literature on Tolkien, there is a little bit of that, but not a huge amount. And so one of the books that does deal with Tolkien and war kind of looks at him more in the context of the war poets, or another one will kind of look at the sort of how much of, there's another book by John Garth, which is about, how much of the Lord of the Rings sort of incubated during the First World War. Other books on Tolkien with philosophers had never really addressed, the philosophy of war. And so I went to von Clausewitz, started looking around von Clausewitz. I'd read von Clausewitz, but not in this way. And so I was like, oh, wait a moment. There's actually all sorts of fascinating tie-ins between the great theorist of war. And then I was thinking like, wait a minute, Tolkien really does have something that would count as a philosophy of war.
Mm-hmm. Which is so surprising from my perspective that no one had done that thought work yet, considering how much of, at least, of course, like you said, the movies move much faster, how much of the content that we see of Tolkien outside of the books be focused on warfare. And yeah, that was just surprising to me that it hadn't been.
Yeah, so here I have a bit of a pet theory about this. I do think that people approach Tolkien for the vibes, and those vibes are all about the Shire. They're all about people drinking ale, smoking pipes. And I love that. I love being immersed in that world. But the books appear to be about something a little graver, a little more's at stake. And so I do think the idea of kind of focusing on war cuts against a little bit what people really like about Tolkien.
Yeah, and it also calls to question what the Shire is for in context to all of the warfare. Can you say more about that maybe, of what the Shire represents?
Yes.
Looking at Tolkien from more of this warfaring perspective and a philosophy about a deeper meaning than just having a really good time with your homies, which of course we love, and that is valuable. That's not meaningless at all. But yeah, what is the different meaning that it takes on in context to something more tragic?
Right. Yeah. So this idea of sort of hanging out with your mates, because I think there's someone on Twitter who's got a really big account on Tolkien. It's called T T-E-A, tea with Tolkien, right? And I love that. I would love that, right? But that kind of gives you an impression of a kind of ease of life. And, there's this famous book by Paul Fussell that looks at the British literature that emerged out of the First World War. And he argues that what you notice is a lot of British literature after the First World War is really kind of focused on the green and pleasant lands. And he argues, well, that's because they were so traumatized by the mud and the gore of the trenches.
Yeah.
But one side picked up in Clausewitz has this idea that battles take on the geography of where they happen. And there are certain environments or certain geographical sort of phenomena that make warfare extremely difficult. And he specifically talks about forests, highly cultivated landscapes. So, a lot of the great, if you just think about the great pressure on Europe historically, has come from the steppes of the Russian plains, right? As these sort of marauding nomadic populations have whipped across the flatlands, and then they kind of hit head on into the kind of super articulated lands of Western Europe. So that got me thinking about the Shire. Oh, wait a moment. The Shire is this super articulated land. Now, of course, the hobbits themselves wouldn't be able to defend the Shire, but it points to this idea and the whole idea of gardens. Samwise is a gardener, forests, that for Tolkien, these are strategically minded places. And when you do look at Tolkien, there's a lot of stuff about landscape and strategy. So the sort of rivers are often talked about strategically. Historically, Gondor had all these guard posts at certain kind of river crossings. So he had really kind of built the geography with the mind of a soldier. And, he did make, there is actually extant a trench map that he made during the Battle of the Somme. And it's actually extremely interesting because at the bottom of the map, he writes, this map was made on the basis of aerial photography. And he really disliked the Air Force, because when his son joined the Air Force in the Second World War, he said, I wish you'd not joined that branch of the war, because I think Air Forces are, and he actually uses the phrase, he says, they're intrinsic evils. And yet he had made a trench map, because he was a signals officer. He had made a trench map using aerial photographers. I was really, fascinated, by that. But the fact is, he made a lot of maps, and those maps sort of convey not exactly the dispositions of armies, but he builds aspects into the map that would be extraordinarily interesting to a general planning a campaign, where you would go, what would be the critical points to take over, etc. So I just started to get the idea that there was a real kind of density of interest in warfare inside of Tolkien writings, and that led to the book.
Yeah, I remember there was a quote that you had in the book that from Tolkien, and I'm going to butcher it so you can totally restate it as he might have, but essentially he said if architects had experienced more fantasy in their life, they would have been better at their jobs. And I think that was really interesting. I agree on the basis of vibes. But it makes me wonder about Tolkien himself when writing The Lord of the Rings, and maybe you can speak to this a little bit more, was he sitting down and writing Lord of the Rings as an academic writes a philosophical paper where there is a lot of intent and focus and planning, and it's very precise and particular, and every word is expressed from a point of very specific intention? Or do you believe that it was more so written like one writes a poem, where there's almost a feeling of sitting back and receiving something? And I ask because it seems as though his experiences with World War I, and then later as you undergo sort of the philosophical analysis of his work, that there's so much there. And not that he didn't mean to, and he just sort of accidentally put in really deep philosophical concepts for us, but I'm just curious how much of Lord of the Rings was written knowing that these were the philosophical concepts and planning for it, or that it was coming from his experiences and his desire to express a fantasy world that could see something that he had felt and experienced.
it was such a great question, because one of the things he actually says was, he says, I found it. I found my writings. They welled up inside me. So I don't think there was anything particularly sort of intentional. Nothing. Probably in the way in which I'd be like a terrible author, right? Because I would have all these philosophical ideas of, I want to realize these philosophical ideas. So there is this interesting thing, right? He read the book Dune, the thing about, the famous science fiction book, and somebody sent a copy of it to him, and so Dune, volume 1 of Dune, and he read it, and he said, I didn't like that. And it's really interesting because it's actually about topics that he writes about. The topics are almost identical, right? The return of a king kind of idea, aristocracies, geography. But I think he probably found the writing almost too conceptual. Because at one point, right, in Dune, there's this idea of, one of them says, the author says, has one of the characters experience a gestalt moment. That's the actual word used. Now, you're never, ever, ever going to find anything remotely, no terms of art, that academics might use, like a gestalt experience, is going to appear in his writing ever. And that's because, right, he reports that he just sort of found the book. I mean, his writings, he sort of found them. Now, we do know he went over, so for example, the Silmarillion, which is the kind of the underlying work of the entire oeuvre, that, he went back over that again and again and again. He kept, I think he did about 30 maps, and he continued to revise them his entire life.
Well,
and it's the same with Silmarillion. It was unfinished when he died. It was completed by Christopher Tolkien. And so there was this, and then Christopher Tolkien says, my father became increasingly preoccupied by the philosophical sort of underpinnings of the book. So I think maybe some more self-conscious concepts maybe did enter in the later draftings. But I think on his own witness, he says it just sort of welled up inside me. Now, what I would say is that when you read his letters, if you would get the volume of the letters, and I would recommend anybody who likes Tolkien to read the letters, first half of them are more or less just about his time in the war, his experience with his children, he's writing to his children when they're at war. But then, of course, when he starts to become sort of famous, people are writing to him constantly about, can you say more about? And almost all of his answers are very either theological or philosophical, some are linguistic. But I mean, immediately as he explains himself, he's explaining himself in academic categories. I point this out in the book. There's a passage that just really kind of blew me away. He writes a letter to someone, and he makes the distinction between moral and non-moral values. And I was like, okay, no ordinary person talks like that. If I said to my mum and dad, about the distinction between moral and non-moral, they'd be like, I don't even understand the words. I don't know what you're talking about. Like if you came down to the kitchen or something like that, and you saw your dad writing a list out of what he's going to do that day, and you said, oh, Dad, what are you doing? He said, I'm just writing down all the non-moral things I have to get done today. You'd be like, what? Right? So there is in value theory this important distinction between moral and non-moral, right? So taking a walk. Now that's very philosophical, because Thomas Aquinas said that taking a walk is always a moral activity. But a lot of philosophers think, no. Just going for a stroll is a non-moral activity. So Tolkien invokes this distinction in a letter, explaining something about his work, right? And clearly, right, this is from the Oxford academic, right? For whom that kind of language is second nature. Now, he keeps it all out of the books, but as he tries to explain the books to people, then he does invariably come to these kind of really big theoretical interests.
Well, and I wonder, as an artist myself, sometimes things have come to me and I've made them. And then upon asking either from myself or an external source about the thing, I'll start to connect it in a more philosophical lens. But it's a really big distinction between doing that and then, or as opposed to having a philosophical idea and saying, I'm going to sit down and make a piece of art about this.
Yes. Yeah. So if I can take us back to this David Jones guy, right? So if you look at his poetry, now David Jones was a modernist. So he was one of these Catholic distributivists that, like Hilaire Belloc and that, he lived with gill at the experimental Catholic artistic poetic world that they built. But if you look at his poems, they often have footnotes where he'll say, oh, I was reading such and such a book on paleontology, and this is now why I made this. So that's that kind of hyper intellectualized modernist, right? And yeah, you just, not only you're not going to find that in Tolkien, right? Tolkien's going to be horrified by that overly self-conscious. So how he kind of put up a block, a filter between the clearly sort of intellectual way he did think about his works and the actual drafting is, I think, I don't know, as a kind of a psychology of the writer, I think it's actually a rather interesting question.
Yeah, precisely. Well, I'd love to get a little bit more into that intellectual assessment that he had of himself, or that I guess actually more so that you have of him in his works and in what you discuss in your text. When it comes to seeing his role or context to the other modern philosophies rolling around in the day, I know that a number of critics have kind of labeled him as more of a medievalist. He's not always seen as a modern philosopher, but you actually say that he brings a modern critique of liberalism through his work. And I would love if you could tell us more about that, because I found that to be really interesting and just a fresh perspective compared to some of the other philosophical commentary that...
Right. Yeah. So I can't really take credit for that in this sense. So one of the things I absolutely love is that one of the very earliest reviews of The Lord of the Rings described it as the last great medieval saga, right? So that it was something like, a new Beowulf kind of concept. Right? I love that. Yeah, right. So the idea that it's a medieval piece of literature, right? And that he was this kind of weird throwback to another age and all this. But there's a recent book by Holly Ordway, and I must say, I think it's the best book on Tolkien. And it's about his appropriation of modern literature. When I read that was pretty decisive in that I was then, okay, it's not out of the realm of possibility that we can maybe start to look for sort of modern connective tissues in the thought world in which he inhabited. He was a very devout Catholic. He got Catholic newspapers. He got conservative newspapers. He knew bunches of Catholic intellectuals. And so I just sort of build up this sort of thought world around war of other Catholic writers at the time that I'm not saying he would have read them, but it's the kind of the spirit of the age. It's what's going on in Catholic circles. And what you discover about a lot of 20th century Catholic ethical political writers is that they all tend to be sort of hostile to sort of liberal progressivism. And sure enough, so is Tolkien, right? I mean, that's got something to do with the setting of the books, the return of valor, the place of sacrifice. I mean, there's nothing about it that's sort of the liberal democratic worldview kind of, that's just not what it's about. So I think he was part of that sort of post-liberal, Catholic, modern, and what I dwell on in the book a little bit to kind of make that more concrete and maybe persuasive to some who do want to think of him, purely as a medievalist, is that in the 19th century, you had all the great philosophies of history emerge. And I think it's quite clear that Tolkien is definitely doing some kind of philosophy of history. And against the sort of the progressive model, right, the kind of like the arc of the universe is turning towards the good, he is explicit that no, the history of this story is a history of decay. It's a history of erosion, civilizations being destroyed. And so it's very interesting, right, that the characters, as they move around the Middle Earth, they'll often come across the ruins of previous civilizations. And he says at one point, and I think I quote it, there's a letter where he says that his mind is the mind of an historian. And so I look at his philosophy of history, which I kind of then oppose to this Gnostic philosophy of history that was super popular under Reitz, Hegel, Marx, fascism in a peculiar way. So I do think the that if somebody said to me, oh, I don't think he's a modernist, I think he's a medievalist, I would say, I just don't really think that can be true, because Thomas Aquinas was not especially interested in history. Right? He wasn't thinking about history. And to go back to our earlier conversation, I do think, I find it hard for someone to read the books and not be thinking Tolkien pretty self-conscious about the role of history. And the characters themselves are often quite, like aware of history, right? In their, so for example, when Lord Elrond, says to Gandalf in, one of the great poignant scenes, he says, my people are leaving these lands. That's like history is culminating, but it's not culminating in the Fukuyama end of history, the glory of the liberal revelation. It's ending in sadness, in mortification, in a certain kind of suffering. So I think that is all in play. And I think I just think having an historical consciousness, I just think is a very modern phenomenon.
Yeah. And I think it would be hard to come out of the trenches of World War I and not have a perspective of the end of history not be somehow a decay, as opposed to some like the concept of history ending in this blissful thing. I mean, I can see why it's kind of been kept to religions over history, because when I don't know if remember the first time I really experienced learning how awful World War I was I listened to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast on it. And it was like, 16 hours or something of really going through that conflict. And it just really made that conflict recognizable to say, wow, this was more than denigrating. This was more than devastating. This was a soulless rip out of the world of life, and yeah, that's very, I don't know how he could have come out of World War I without some sort of perspective that civilizations are going to end in a very sad, they're going to meet a sad end. Yeah.
And I think, he says right there, I've got the mind of an historian. And of course, one thing about, you look at history, right, it's all about civilizations that have evaporated, that have collapsed, that have often at times had cataclysmic collapses, and sometimes super surprising cataclysmic collapses. So, he's just, I think, super aware of that. He builds it into the stories. And I think, World War I for him, yes, it's exactly as you say, but, he was quite proud of his regiment. They won the most medals for valor in the British Army, the Lancashire Fusiliers. And he's always quite proud of his regiment. He was proud of his service, even though he was hospitalized out with trench fever. And I don't want for a moment to minimize, the suffering and the horror. And, he says, that by the time of the war, many of his friends were dead, so that idea. So this idea of the world as a kind of a grief, I think is super strong in Tolkien. And I think you see this, I'm always fascinated by Galadriel. And the Amazon new TV show, I couldn't really watch it, because Galadriel, she's this super problematic figure in the Silmarillion. And much of her life is a life of atonement, what she did early on in her life. And I think that's a super Tolkien idea, that someone in the face of it, someone atoning could still do enormous good, but don't whitewash it. Don't pretend that Galadriel is just this she is a heroine, but she's not just flawed. I mean, she did really bad stuff back in the day, 10,000 years ago. But then that also makes her life so astonishing, right? Because literally lives for millennia, in atonement for what she did. So that seems to me to add a tremendously rich sort of psychological aspect to Tolkien's writings. He's often accused of being a bit one-dimensional. There's no real psychology, but I think quite the opposite. I mean, I think like Galadriel's story arc, is bearing one of the rings of preservation, and yet given the kind of disruption that she introduced in the early stage of her life, and that this is then her burden, to kind of correct the flaws that she helped herself introduce into Middle Earth, I think is an enormously rich idea of service.
Yeah, I mean, and I could see that critique of saying Tolkien's psychology of character is a little more one-dimensional when you're looking at the normal length or the normal time span of someone's life. We think about like, oh, well, these Galadriel, in the time of the humans that we are reading about, was a really good person, and that's it. That's all she was. But when you look at the 10,000 foot view, the 10,000 year view, it's a very different story.
I've also been struck by that Gandalf, he's a pupil of this goddess, angel, Nienna, and she's this sort of god of patient suffering. And when he's not down on Earth, Middle Earth, like sort of helping the war, he's her pupil, right? And so her window, Tolkien describes it, right? And this, for me, it blew me away, right? She says sort of this window, and this window looks out onto the abyss, onto the bit of the world that God never did anything with. So it's sort of this empty, lonely, and she sort of sits and she sort of meditates on the world's suffering. And then, Gandalf is her pupil. He sits with her and does the same. And that, but then of course he goes on active service, right? But this idea of these souls carrying these astonishing burdens and knowledge of suffering and bearing it. I just think that's fantastically rich and, sort of Christian theological lamentations. So anyway, that's kind of where I would strongly resist, because it is part of the criticism of Tolkien in the literature that, he's, kind of simple-minded, he's kind of good versus evil, right? But as you say, right, when you plug in the length of history and the fullness of what some of these characters are doing, then it's by no means because we meet Gandalf and he's this sort of funny warrior kind of, right? But then in the kind of the long duration of his life, he's this figure of mourning.
I'd love to hear you say more about what Tolkien's view of warfare was and its role within civilization. We see, the decay of civilization, and your book reminded me that Hume thought that the war camp was the basis of the city, which I just chuckled. I was like, sure, Hume. But I would love for you to say more about how Tolkien saw that. And did he have it in his letters? Are you pulling this from the books themselves? I just want the whole view.
He says that war is an inevitable condition of human existence because humans, he says, are never satisfied with the good and the beautiful. They always want yet more. But he says something very curious and interesting. He says that humans have a tendency to make secret societies. And in making these secret societies, they have a tendency to veer off into some pretty dark areas of the human psyche. So he thought that he regretted war, right? Because he thought war was very constricting. He says at one point, so he said a number of different things about his life in the trenches. On occasion, he will say, oh yeah, I started to sketch out some ideas in the trenches. And on another occasion, he'll say, you couldn't do anything in the trenches, and of course, right, this sort of single-mindedness of the soldier just to get through to the next day, the next hour. So war is something inescapable because humans don't, in fact, they struggle to find satisfaction in the good and the beautiful. And begin the book with, on his honeymoon, he went to this famous gorge in England where some of the earliest human remains have been found. So kind of Neolithic. And the thing is, in this gorge has also been found drinking cups made of human skulls. And I point out that recent forensics on the famous sort of hand paintings in the Neolithic caves, these hand paintings were actually made with severed hands that have had the tops of their fingers chopped off. So there's a kind of a grimness to the human being. And I think Tolkien strongly believed that. You've been to war. So, like how that is, like a lot of people think, the problem with Tolkien is he's this kind of like encouraging young boys to believe in the glamour of war. And I think, no, it's the very opposite, right? He thinks that war is grim, well, because humans are grim. Then the question is, how do we find ennoblement within that grimness? And so what you notice about the Silmarillion, very first page of it, the war begins. Melkor, Sauron's boss, rebels against God, attacks some of the gods, and then the war cascades and spreads out from there. But also then the elves, right? God's sort of first creation, right? It doesn't take them long before they're starting to make oaths that commit them, this is where Galadriel comes in problematically, commit them to carnage against their fellow elves, right? So there's something about humans that we just can't get it right. We're this very, very flawed animal, right? And so this would, of course, I think fit with a kind of Christian idea that grace is needed to perfect nature. So I think that's that kind of, so he's not a warmongerer. He doesn't welcome war, but he also thinks it's inescapable.
You mentioned Aquinas a little bit earlier, and I think for our Catholic listeners, which I know there are some of you, they would love to hear a little bit more about, you discussed specifically that Aquinas' definition of vanity is very important in understanding Tolkien's philosophy of war. And I am not the learned philosopher like you are. So please, can you tell us more about what Tolkien's relationship with Aquinas was, and both how it applies to his philosophy, and then also, second layer, how familiar was Tolkien with Aquinas directly versus just being part of the Catholic ethos of the time?
Yeah. I mean, he read Aquinas. There are specific mentions. You got the books, right? The Silmarillion, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings. And then there's all this sort of like ambient literature that he wrote. Ambient, like other things he was thinking about in connection with the stories, and, it never made it. And some of them are, he speculates about what kind of astronomy the Numenorians would have had and all this sort of stuff, right? And he even gets into it. He literally cites Aquinas on hylomorphism at one point in some of this ambient literature. But the point about vanity, I think, is not specific to Aquinas. It's just part of the moral theological tradition. And, vanity is the first enumerated deadly sin, right? Pride is the source, but amongst the enumerated 7, vanity is the first enumerate. And vanity has this double structure. And I do think you see this a lot in the books. On the one hand, the vain puff themselves up, but one way to puff yourself up is, of course, by belittling others, right? So if you think about gossiping, right? So gossiping, you belittle someone and also kind of, and of course, we wouldn't be doing that, would we?
Never.
Right? You build yourself up by pointing out flaws that others have. And of course, we don't have those flaws. So that's the belittling aspect. And you see this with Sauron, right? So Sauron is a belittler. There's a brilliant line from Gandalf where Gandalf says something like, it would make Sauron happier that the hobbits were no longer happy and that they were slaves. He would rather see them like that than these sort of fat and happy folk, right? So there's this sort of malign interest in seeing others pulled off that pedestal, pulled down. Vanity is not merely just like me kind of wanting to get ahead. It's also like, wait a minute, I'm going to bring somebody down a peg or two. And of course, that will indirectly boost me, right? And so I do think, you see this in the character of Sauron himself, right? That he's this figure of vanity. And of course, as the moral theological tradition points out, that's a deadly sin, right? That'll eat you alive, right? I mean, of course, the deadly sins are primarily about the death of the soul. Von Clausewitz points this out, right? How many wars have been conducted for the vanity of the generals, right? And you see this all the time, right? I mean, you might think that something like the current war in Ukraine should be brought to a close because it looks like it's only going to end one way, and yet people are still being sacrificed for a war that appears to already have been lost. But vanity of leaders and what have you means, no, we can't let it end, right? So this, von Clausewitz says, is actually one of the most common theories, one of the most common phenomena in history. So I think that Tolkien is really alert to this problem of vanity. And just because I think you really see it in Sauron, and you also see it in Saruman. So you'll note that Saruman is always trying to bring down Gandalf, right? So he says, oh, I don't know why you hang out with those hobbits. They're useless creatures, and yet you hang out with them. What does that say about your judgment? I mean, he's like, he's really snide and like critical. And so I just think that Tolkien was, I suspect Tolkien was a master observer of the vanities of others.
Yeah, well, and going back to what you said about humans and secret societies, like, what is a more fun way to have a secret society than to sit around with a group of secret people and talk about how you're so much better than everybody else, which of course we never do.
And then of course, right, like with the Numenorians, right? So the Numenorians are blessed with extra long life, extra intelligence, extra beauty. But in terms of their vanity, they want yet more, right? So they want to go to the land of the gods, and the gods say, no, you can't come here. Like, go off and do your own thing. We're not stopping you from having an incredible existence. The only thing is, don't come and visit us. And the Numenorians are like, no, we're going to come and visit you. And why? Because they believe that if they step on the undying lands, they themselves will become immortal. So here's a good example about Tolkien's idea that you can give people enormous quantities of good and beauty. They will still want more, and they will still seek to sort of puff themselves up. And so there's actually this very, very beautiful moment in the sort of the appendices of Lord of the Rings, which is Aragorn's death. The Numenorians have the possibility of giving up life, so they can choose the moment of their death. And Arwen says to him, please stay with me longer, because she's now going to live kind of for eternal life alone, right? And he says no. He says, I must do as my forefathers were meant to do, and I must take my moment to leave life. And of course, that's a direct answer to the collapse of Numenorian civilization, who refused the gift of death, right? He sort of brings this whole story of the Numenorian arc to a close.
Oh, that makes me very excited, because my next question, which I felt was off topic, but you just made it not off topic. I'm not sure where it came from, just my ambient Lord of the Rings lore. I was remembering that, I think it was Tolkien or Gandalf, I don't know, somebody was saying about Lord of the Rings that man was gifted with a shorter lifespan. And in the context of our conversation of, these lengths showing us the complexity of characters, and the Numenorians having this own struggle with their capacity to leave but not wanting to, how do you see the race of mankind within Tolkien's world? How does that impact how war is played out, and how they engage with it differelly versus the other types of beings in the landscape?
Yeah, so if I may just start with the elves a second. So like Lord Elrond, like by the time we meet Lord Elrond, I don't know how many thousands of years old that guy is, right? But the problem is, he's sort of exhausted. He's exhausted by his service, right? So if war is a kind of a permanent feature, and you're Lord Elrond, then it's your responsibility to be sort of constantly at war, right? And this is actually really fascinating, because Gandalf, at the end of it, when Gandalf is talking to Aragorn, and he says, look, we've defeated Sauron, but there will be wars in your future. And so if you've lived for these sort of, in Aragorn's case, hundreds of years, Lord Elrond's case, thousands of years, Galadriel, 10,000 years, and it's been this life of service, that is just, you can almost see where death would be a gift, right, at that point, right? Now, Tolkien says, it's fascinating. There's an interview, it's hilarious. There's an interview on the BBC close to the time when he dies. And it's a television interview, it's in black and white. The coolest thing is if you actually see there must have been a photographer there doing stills, because when you see the still shots, and you don't see this in the actual little documentary that they were making about Tolkien, he's smoking his pipe, but he's also got a big pitcher of beer on a side table with a big mug. And so he's clearly smoking, pounding the beer while he's doing this little interview. But at one point he pulls out a newspaper clipping, and I think it's from Simone de Beauvoir, or it might be from Hannah Arendt, I forget. And the little and he says, if I may, I just want to read you, and he unfolds this newspaper clipping. And he says, I just want to read you something from, let's say it's Hannah Arendt. And she says that humans are always astonished that they have to die. They're insulted by death because we're so fantastic. How can people, so it's a vanity problem, right? How can people as fantastic as us have to die? And he says, that's what my books are about. My books are about the acceptance of death. Now, he then also said other things. My books are about only God may be given honor. He did change different things to different people about what his books were really about. But it is really fascinating, this final this interview, where he brings up whether one can accept death. And then if you think about sort of techno-science, futurism, this whole and this, of course, is the Numenorian story, right? They're this kind of, in terms of futurism, they would be the sort of poster children of Futurism. You see, it's all about this sort of problem, and this also then makes something like the death of Boromir extremely potent, right? Because again, another example of a man dying, needing to atone, and yet he does sort of accept his sacrifice for the sake of the hobbits, whom he knows he has destroyed. He knows he cannot atone, so he dies a terrible, tragic death, but he nonetheless dies it in nobility. Despite the shocking flaw, the threat that he's now posed to all of Middle-earth, he nonetheless tries to find an ennobling moment within it. And that is, of course, his acceptance of his death, a sacrifice unto death. So I just, again, think it's just enormously powerful. And again, Tolkien was an orphan. By the age of 12, I think he was an orphan. And so death was very, very prominent. Obviously, never mind the war, that he fought in. Death was enormously prominent in his mind. And of course, he had been at death's door himself through the trench fever, that he was in hospital for 2 years with that. And so this was a kind of, was very dominant in his life and his storytelling. I think there's both personal reasons, there's theological reasons, and I think there's really rich kind of psychological reasons as well.
All right, last question. The cover of the book features some sunflowers, and on the title page, there's also a print of a sunflower. And I don't know if I maybe missed it within the text itself, but what is the significance of the sunflower to you, and why you chose that for part of the book?
So, I think Catholic University of America Press did a beautiful job with the graphics, the way they did kind of Tolkien writing for the headings in the book and all that. And they actually picked the cover. They have an artist pick out the cover, and she worked up. And the thing is about it, it's by this, I think he was like a Scottish Canadian. His name's MacDonald. It's on the cover. It's on MacDonald. And she'd said that she'd been in this gallery in Canada and she'd seen it. And she was like, oh my gosh, I would love to put that on a cover someday. And so here was her moment. But the thing was, so it had nothing to do with me really, except when they asked about the book cover, I said, well, the idea of gardening and the idea of fertile land and the idea of green spaces as having strategic value is a really important part of the book. And so they said, okay, right, well, we'll try to get some kind of artwork that has both like a garden, but a kind of a marred, a kind of flawed garden. And the coolest thing is that painting was done in 1916, the year that he was at the Battle of the Somme. So when they came up with that idea, I was like, wow, yeah, just
put that on my book. Thank you.
Well, I can only thank the artist and CUA for going to all the trouble of making it look super pretty.
Well, Professor McAleer, I just have so enjoyed this conversation. And I remember at the start, you said you'd always been interested in the ideas of order and discord. And it harkens back to, for those of you who don't know, the Silmarillion, the start of Middle-earth. It is sung into being, and it's McAleer who starts singing in discord, which brings the first war. And I think it's just fitting that you and Tolkien have been able to share this book together to bring about something really very, very interesting and engaging. So thank you.
No, thank you. Thanks for the direction you took the conversation. Thrilled you liked the book, and glad you liked the artwork on it.
Thank you for tuning in on today's episode with Madison's Notes. Of course, you can follow us on all major podcasting platforms and find us on social media at the James Madison Program. Feel free to send this episode to a friend or a foe or an ultra Lord of the Rings nerd. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.